Hi guys, welcome to your screencast on periodisation of training for our exercise and physiology paper. So this is the specification that we're looking at. So what we need to know, what you'll be questioned on is the periodisation cycles, we've got here the three of them, the phases of training that we have, tapering to optimise our performance, and then finally how to plan personal health and fitness programs using these periodisation cycles and phases of training here for aerobic capacity, strength and flexibility training. So hopefully at the end of this screencast, at the end of our lesson, we should be able to do said plan for aerobic capacity. Type of questions that you might be getting in terms of your exam. Here we have a 3 marker. So a talented sports performer is focused on international selection for the World Championships in 12 months' time. Using a sport of your choice, show how the performer would split their 12 months of training into periodisation cycles. So for that one, you are discussing the cycles. What is meant by the term tapering in sport? Analyse its effectiveness for a sports performer. So again, we're looking at tapering to optimise performance. And then finally here we've got the 3 phases of training are named below. Outline what is meant by each phase. Whilst using a sporting example, describe a specific objective for each phase. So that is what we're going to be able to answer at the end of this screencast. So first of all, what is periodisation? Okay, so periodisation is the division of training into specific blocks, periods or phases. Let's just think of it as specific blocks. Okay, so it's division of training, or splitting up our training into specific blocks. The objective of this is to progressively develop and reach physiological peak at the correct time. I have an example for you on this screencast. If I'm going to use an example right now, if you think of an athlete training for the Olympics in 4 years' time, they would have to periodise their program. They would have to split their program into specific blocks so that they hit absolute physiological peak in 4 years. They don't be reaching it in 3.5 years, 3 years. They need to be reaching their physiological peak in 4 years for the Olympic Games. And obviously it takes a lot of programming to do that. So first of all, periodisation cycles. So when we're talking about the cycles now, we are going to use marathon running as a concrete example. Okay, you have to use examples within a lot of these exam questions, and it's really important that we just have a concrete example that we can just go to straight away. So we're going to use the periodisation cycles focusing on a marathon runner. When it comes to examples in your exams, you can use your own, however, let's just stick with marathon running for now as it's an easier one to do. So first of all, the first cycle that we have, or a cycle that we have, is called a macro cycle. Now the macro cycle is a long-term training plan aimed to achieving a long-term goal, typically lasting from 6 months to 1 year. So our example, marathon running, the macro cycle is the long-term plan. The long-term plan is to run a marathon in 6 months. We've got here. It could be run a marathon in 1 year. That is the macro cycle that we have. That is our long-term training plan. So then with a macro cycle, we then have a mesocycle. Now mesocycles are our medium-term plan aimed at achieving a medium-term goal, typically lasting from 1 month to 4 months. E.g. improving aerobic capacity. So if we're looking at our marathon runner right now, our macro cycle is to be able to run a marathon in 6 months. Therefore, our medium-term plan has to be, we have to improve our aerobic capacity so that we have the ability to run the marathon in 6 months. Therefore, our medium-term plan might be a 3-month plan of improving aerobic capacity. From this, we have a microcycle. So the microcycle is our short-term plan of training, typically lasting from 1 session to 3 weeks. So how are we going to achieve our first of all, how are we going to achieve our macro cycle? How are we going to achieve our long-term aim of running a marathon? We're going to improve our aerobic performance, and we use that in the mesocycle for our medium-term goals. How are we going to achieve our medium-term goal of achieving improvements in aerobic capacity? Well, we need to perform continuous training or HIIT training. So therefore, our microcycle is our short-term plan. How am I going to achieve my medium-term plan of improving aerobic capacity? I'm going to do continuous training. For a marathon runner, you choose continuous training because it's a lot more specific than HIIT training. So there, They are your cycles. Please make sure you have got this information down in your Cornell note style. Please make sure you have questions around those. 2 or 3 questions for each cycle would be fantastic, and also what periodization is. So that right there are our periodization cycles, using the concrete example of a marathon runner. The macro cycle would be our long-term plan of achieving being able to run a marathon. Mesocycle is how we're going to do that in the medium term. We're going to improve our aerobic capacity. Microcycle is how we're going to improve our aerobic capacity. We'll do continuous training. So, phases of training. So we have 3 distinct phases of training. First one is preparatory phase. So this is the pre-season training block. This is when we have high intensity and high volume. We're going to use football as an example with regards to phases of training. Okay, so if we're thinking about football, the preparatory phase is our pre-season phase. High intensity, high volume, e.g. football player having peak fitness for the start of the season. That is why we do pre-season, so that when the season starts, we're ready to go. Second phase of training is the competitive phase. Okay, so what do we do during competition? How is our training phase during competition? We know during pre-season it's high intensity, high volume. So when we're actually in the competition as a football player playing in the Premier League 3 times a week, how are we going to change our training? We're going to do something called tapering, which we come on to a bit later, which you saw was in the specification. So we taper to reduce our workload. So during the actual competition, we taper our training to reduce our workload, saving energy to win a cup final, or we might do tactical or shape work. For example, Premier League players around Christmas, they're playing 3 times a week. If you're in Champions League as well, just after Christmas, you are playing again 3 times a week. You can't keep the intensity high and the volume high during that. You'll cause injury. So phases of training within competition, we reduce our workload. So what we'll work on is we'll work on tactical work. We'll work on our shape. We'll work on structural things within our competition. You're still doing high intensity work, but a lot less volume. Okay, so the intensity still stays high, but less volume. But mainly during competition, we're tapering to reduce our workload. And finally, we have our transition. Now, transition is our post-season. So once the season has finished, this is our rest and recovery. However, we still need to maintain our fitness. So, for example, football are having time off to maintain motivation. You heard after the Euros in 2021 this year, 2020 Euros, and it was played this year, you heard that the footballers, all of a sudden, they've got to start the Premier League in a few weeks' time. A lot of them would have gone on holiday post-season for rest and recovery. However, on these holidays, they would still maintain their fitness. They would still do some fitness work. I don't know if any of you are following any footballers on Instagram. However, you see videos of certain players, they're out in Dubai and they're still doing fitness with their personal coach, even though they are on holiday. They still have to maintain that fitness. So we've got periodization cycles, we've got phases of training, preparatory, competitive, and transition. So let's look at this word tapering in a bit more detail. So tapering was one of the things that we need to know with regards to the spec. You might get a question to analyse tapering. You saw that a second ago when I went for the questions. You also might be asked to evaluate the use of tapering to optimise performance. So if we're thinking of tapering and what it is, so what it is it's reducing our training load. Spelling error there, my bad. So reducing training load prior to the event to maintain, preserve glycogen stores. So happens within this competitive phase, doesn't it? So we taper our training to reduce our workload. So reducing training load means the volume of training, i.e. during the Premier League season, when they're playing potentially 2 or 3 times a week, they're not training every day. They're not doing high intensity, high load of training every day. They reduce their load. So they'll do tactical work, strategic work, and they might do some high intensity work, but it would be very minimal. And this is used to maintain and preserve our glycogen stores. So if you're asking to evaluate tapering, what are the advantages of tapering? Well, said right there, so the advantages, it's going to optimize our performance if we taper, because we're going to maximize our energy stores. We're not going to deplete our energy stores during training. We're keeping them for the game situations. And it's really good as well for recovery. So we taper our training sessions to optimize our performance by maximizing our energy stores and helping to recover. So once again, if we are using Premier League football as an example, a lot of the teams, especially around Christmas time, their training session will be very reduced. Their load will be tapered massively, and basically it's about maximising energy stores and recovery. So when it comes to the next game, they are able to play to their optimised performance. The disadvantages with this is it can introduce lethargy. Okay, so you can become lethargic from this, and also weight gain, because your eating habits won't change, but yet you are not working as much as you were previously. Therefore, it can lead to weight gain. So that is periodisation cycles, our phases of training, and tapering. I have got one little bit of extra information that you do need to know, but it's not in the specification, so they cannot directly ask you a question on what I'm going to show you in a minute. I'm going to show you principles of training. Okay, now, as I said, principles of training don't come up in the specification. It does in GCSE, and it causes a few students some issues when it comes to principles of training. As I've said, they cannot ask you a direct question on principles of training within a paper because it's not in specification. What they can do is they may ask you a 20 marker, which is on phases of training or tapering or periodisation. And what you might be able to do in 20 mark is add in principles of training. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the principles of training up here, and I'll just quickly talk through them, make sure you get some information down on them, you're kind of familiar with them. However, they can't ask you directly about this. This would just come in useful if it's a 20 marker, just to bump up your marks a bit more. Okay, so moderation, basically everything in moderation. So training in moderation, do not overdo it. If we're looking at reversibility, if you don't use it, you lose it, is what we say reversibility, i.e. you might make some gains, but then you stop working, therefore your body's going to lose it. So that is what reversibility is. Try and think, if you don't use it, you lose it. With reversibility, we have specificity. Is the training specific to what you want to achieve? For example, marathon runner specific training would be running continuous. It would not be swimming or cycling continuous. That's not specific enough for a marathon runner. If we look at progression, this is steadily progressing your training program to make it slightly difficult each time. You have to do this safely or else it will cause injury. So we need to progressively overload the body as opposed to just going straight from doing not running at all to I'm going to run a half marathon on Sunday, then next Sunday I'm going to run a marathon. That is not progression. That would cause injury. Overload relates to the FIT principles that we've been working on: frequency, intensity, time, and type. If you frequency, i.e. if you train too often, then it could potentially cause injury, especially if you are training at a high intensity. So overload can cause injury or increase the risk of injury. And then finally, the last one, variance. Vary training to prevent boredom. Okay, so with aerobic capacity, you are not constantly doing continuous training because it can become boring. You're using variance, and you are using a variety of different training methods. So they're principles of training. As I said, that would be in a 20 marker, just a few you would kind of put in a 20 marker. Okay, you'd use continuous training for a marathon runner to improve aerobic capacity because this relates to the principle of training specificity because it's specific. Okay, something really simple like that. Thank you for listening. Bye.